is called the Visual Semantics of Diaspora. And we are having two artists here, Jason Francisco, who will be introduced by Larry, and the work of Paul Gardier, who is a Haitian painter and philosopher. And in McGuinness, as you may have seen, we are having the work of Pok Chi Lau, who have been documenting the Chinese American diaspora for the last 30 years. I'd like to introduce my good colleague and friend and thank him for doing another, project together.
Really grazie.
Really grazie.
So this exhibit is an integral part, as Ricardo explained, of this project that we, mainly Ruth, Ricardo and I, have named the Diaspora Project, which is a campus-wide project that involves numerous courses that have a module or a segment having to do with the theme of diaspora, and it incorporates programs throughout the semester, this being, I believe, the first one, actually. Next week, Wake Zion was the first one, right, and so this is the second one, and next week, on Wednesday night, and you're all encouraged to come, is Pharaoh's Daughter, a world music group that's going to be at Packard Auditorium on Wednesday night. So as we conceived of this event, we realized from the very beginning that diaspora is by no means uniquely Jewish. Particularly in the modern world, diaspora is a term that's applied to the experience of multiple cultures and multiple groups. And to some people, it even defines the contemporary world. The idea of movement, the idea of flow, the idea of disruption are things that characterize the experience of many people. And when I first saw Jason's work, it was about to come out at that time in his book, Far From Zion, Jews, Diaspora and Memory. Ruth and I, Ricardo and me, we thought that this would be a wonderful way to represent the concept of Jewish diaspora. Jason Francisco is a photographer, he is a book artist, and he is a writer. He's been teaching at the Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University since 2000. He's also taught at Stanford University and at the University of Pennsylvania. Far From Zion is his first book of photographs. He has a second book project in the work, which is called Impulses, Aims, and Oscillations, Photography in San Francisco's Chinatown. He's published many articles in addition to his photography, and he's also had solo exhibitions in a number of communities, including Philadelphia, New York, and Budapest, among other places. And so I would like to just conclude the introduction by reading you his beginning in the foreword to his book, Far From Zion. It's right up there, so you can read along and see if I make any mistakes. Jason writes as follows: the photographs in this book contemplate Jewish life in Europe and North America, from Kiev to California, Birkenau to Brooklyn, in an effort to address the insistent and contradictory history of Ashkenazic Jewry in the last century. The history has rendered Jewish life variously strong in Jewishness, marooned in Jewishness, deprived but not purged of Jewishness, torn from but subsisting in Jewishness, Jewishly spent, Jewishly dirigible, and largely without communal formations that would authorize or legitimate this range. My effort, he writes here, is neither to recuperate nor to mitigate this predicament. Rather, it's to put positions in the Jewish life world into searching relations, and so to limn the ties that bind communities to individuals and to the imagination of a collective life. My intuition is of the fair vision of Jewish life in diaspora. Its scatteredness, compositeness, adaptiveness, lies in the relay of meaning between its parts. Join me in welcoming Jason Francisco.
I I'd like to thank Larry and Ricardo, and I'm really happy to see this show here and to be part of this this initiative. Is that the way it's describing it? I've never actually seen this kind of campus-wide humanities initiative that is as ambitious as this one, and I'm really looking forward to the conference, which you didn't plug, but you could have.
No, I didn't. You'll get plenty of propaganda about the conference.
Here we are.
And I'm happy that all of you could make it out today. I thought what we could do is take a walking look at the photographs rather than a sitting look at slides, as Ricardo said. Since the photographs here are, in fact, the very prints that were used to make this book. These are whatever the prints are, these are the prints themselves. And I can't make slides that look as good as they look. I don't think I could make another set of prints that look as good as they look, maybe, but I certainly couldn't represent them as well in slides. So if it's agreeable to you, then we can walk a little, and I'd like to maybe explore some of the dimensions of these pictures as I see them. I'd really be quite interested in taking questions or hearing comments that anyone has about these pictures. I guess maybe the first and most obvious thing to say is that the question of when we have a book, especially a book of photographs, there's often some ambiguity as to whether the book represents the work or whether the book is the work. And I think that now that the book exists, I think I see the book as the work. And I see this set of pictures on the wall here as an interpretation of the work, rather than a parallel project to the work. But I think that the book is, in fact, the truer experience of the work. And so I would, I guess, encourage everyone, if you haven't spent some time with the book, also to take a look at the book.
They are on the back. The book is on the back.
There is a copy of the book that's on the table in the back.
And also there is a list here
Yeah.
of the 65 images that we have here,
Right.
the titles, in case
Right.
somebody wants to.
The photographs that are on the wall, I guess that begs the question in some ways about the way this show is put up here. Not all of the photographs in the book are here in this exhibition. There were photographs that seem to work better in the context of this sequence, or actually this set of 5 sequences, which is what we have, what I made here, than simply what was in the book. So there is a little bit of discrepancy that might be interesting for some people. The book actually comprises, it's a book that, I guess you could say comprises 2 parallel projects. And to that, in that it does, this exhibition is a little does misrepresent things a bit. One half of the project is a sequence of photographs. The second half is a sequence of numbered texts. And the texts and the photographs, they work against each other and sometimes with each other. There are no captions in the back of the book. My editor actually worried a little bit that people would think that the numbers represented captions for the photographs. I think it becomes pretty clear when you spend even a couple of minutes with the text that that's not the case. There is some information below the plates here that represents what we would call captioning type of information. But in the show here, there is only a little bit of the textual component of the book represented. And it's represented, as you can see, in 2 forms. One is these floating statements below the photographs, and the other is, from time to time, as if in the place of a photograph, a piece of text. It's not actually in the place of the photograph. It acts as if it were in the place of the So if you're interested in the language that that's going on here in this room, then the place to turn is really to this book. And I can't really begin even to recapitulate what the text tells. I can refer to it, but you simply have to read that text. Has anybody here ever seen a show of photographs displayed like this before? It's a little unorthodox, I'd say.
Good use of the term.
Right? It's a little unorthodox. It's actually a little orthodox in another way. I could explain that too. What about it is unorthodox? Well, I guess first of all, the lack of frames, the lack of mats, the use of the wall to lean pictures against rather than to hang pictures from. The presence of a shelf that makes a line, the line or a set of lines. The lines might suggest a certain kind of continuity is present. That's a question. The height of the photographs, which is rather lower than you might often see photographs displayed on walls. And most of all, the unvarnished, no, that's not the right word. The lack of any mediating presence between you and the image itself, and the image which is now an object. It's an object that's leaning dependent in a certain way against this wall. Ricardo and I had a lot of conversations when we were laying out the show about how best to do it, and I was pretty insistent on doing something that would counteract what I think of as the authoritative act of framing a picture and hanging it on a wall. I wanted to break the spell of the picture's authority in some meaningful way. I wanted to make the picture approachable. And hopefully in its approachability, I wanted the encounter with the image to be even more direct than it would be, even more, what's the word, searing or captivating or something than it would be if it were hung in a safe, expected way in a frame on a wall. That involved making the pictures a little vulnerable. You might back into it in 1 second. It's part of the risk that I agreed to take. Photographs, I think that the experience of photographs on walls is sort of, in a way, the exceptional experience of photographs in our lives. As much of the time or more of the time, photographs are things to be handled. And when we put them on a wall, we distance ourselves from the tactile relationship that we often have with them. As a photographer, especially when it's your own body of work, it's something that handling your pictures is something that's very integral. In a book, you handle pictures in a different sense. You are required to do that. You're required to form a kind of physical relationship with the photographs. Now, we didn't go that far that we asked, we could have done a very avant-garde installation that would have involved putting pictures on tables or something and asking people to pick them up. We did talk about that, yeah. Asking people to pick them up and carry them around or something. That would have been a very avant-garde.
Yeah, you could have put them in chunks and have us discover them.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we could have gone very far in the direction of a performative exhibition like that, a performance that would have required you, the viewer, to do some kind of performance in order to see the pictures. But we held off from that a little bit.
For obvious reasons.
What's that?
For obvious reasons.
For obvious reasons. Well,
we want them back.
Yeah.
We want them back. Although I did put a handmade book in the corner there, which is a unique book. There's only one copy of it in the world, and I'm happy that people will handle it and look at it. So
we got white gloves there.
Right.
that's also right. Okay, so anyway, that in case you were wondering any of those things, why the exhibition looks the way it looks, that's my claim on why it looks the way it looks. You don't have to believe me, of course. You can better if you don't in some ways. All right, so how can I begin to tell you about these pictures from where I stand? The project took many years to do. It was a project that sort of crept up on me as I experienced it. I didn't conceive of it. It kept nagging at me. I didn't conceive of it as something I needed to do until it just seemed to sort of impose itself on me. I'm a documentary photographer, or I call myself a documentary photographer, and most of my work before that, and I guess after this project also, has had to do with looking at other people, looking to other people, looking at other people, what it means to encounter others or the other in images, and the status of the other in what the status of the social other is in photographs. There are many projects I've done which I won't talk about. At a certain point it occurred to me that I was doing this for reasons I couldn't ignore that had to do with my own background. And that was the origin of a series of travels that eventually became this project. Some of you might know the work of Walker Evans and Robert Frank, two very canonical American photographers. Well, Frank is not born in this country, but he's not considered an American photographer. And both of them are important for many reasons, but among them because they attempted and succeeded in presenting a picture of a civilization at certain moments in its evolution. I began this project thinking that I might be able to do such a thing with Ashkenazic Jewish civilization, as it were, at the end of a very eventful and brutal century. And I set out as a Jew and as someone who wanted to do this for Jewish civilization, as it were. I set out to travel across Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and across the United States, looking for what counted as Jewish civilization now. And I found out that it was after a long time of photographing, I found out that it was an impossible demand. It was an impossible subject to answer, and that I would fail. In a sense, the very terms of my project demanded that I fail, because what I found out was what I in a way already knew, that Jewish civilization, or Ashkenazic Jewish civilization, is so composite and fragmented, internally fragmented, that even to suggest that it exists as an intact thing was to beg a question. So then my project changed somewhat, and I began to try to figure out a way of representing that very condition of loss and non-intactness as itself an answer to my original question. That effort is what you see here. What you see here is a set of points, as I see it, a set of points within a Jewish geography that's also a Jewish history. Each point, as I see it, is a certain moment of unfinishedness or brokenness that might have associative reach. It might have the capacity to touch even the picture next to it. But we don't know. Ultimately, we don't know. It's a proposition. So the book begins with this picture, and it ends with that picture. Those are the beginning and ending pictures of the book. They were made in the same cemetery in Berdichev in Ukraine. To begin and end in a cemetery was a consequential decision. To begin and end in a cemetery in which there's virtually no Jewish signifier was likewise to be, and in a sense it was a neat decision. It was a decision that imposed a kind of roundness to the project. I suppose you could also consider it an artificial or a sort of a literary device to suggest that the book is not a linear, in a sense that the project is not a linear thing, but it's actually, it's a movement that keeps going. And one could have made many other sequences that began and ended in the same point and found their way around. This is one example. From a cemetery, in fact, this opening sequence to about here represents the opening sequence of the book itself. I guess I should say something about sequencing. Sequencing in photography is a never-ending issue. It's a never-ending issue. And it's not an inconsequential issue. It is the consequential issue. As a photographer of this kind, the task is to come up with individual pictures that have some insight in them. But that's not, photographic meaning only begins with the arrival of those pictures in my viewfinder or in my camera. It's actually the relationships between pictures that begin to circulate meaning, photographic meaning. That is the documentary tradition right there in a nutshell. That's what the documentary tradition is about. It's about associative or relational meaning. The same set of pictures means something potentially very different in a different set of associations. There is no stable meaning. It's a meaning that comes from, it comes from the act of making connections between pictures. And in a way, it's a never-ending thing. You could think of, and I've often made this analogy to myself, there are types of literary analysis that involve taking a single text and pulling motifs or pulling moments or pulling certain types of information from the text and putting them together in a way that reveals the inner dimensions of that text. The text has a surface. The surface is the beginning of the investigation into the interior of the text, if you want to call it, if you want to use that metaphor, the interior of the text. That's precisely my attitude towards making meaning, social meaning through pictures. So this represented one sequence. This is a different sequence. And if I show this work again, I'll probably make a different sequence. And that's just the nature of the task here. Or as my friend Haskell Semanowitz tells me, if you've made a good book, the book doesn't finish. The book doesn't contain itself. That's his way of putting it to me, and he's right, I think. He has the right words for it. There's always a question of there's always a demand on the viewer when you work in this way, because in a sense every photograph is a proposition to another photograph, and the two of them are a proposition to a viewer. You can accept that proposition, or maybe you don't accept the proposition. Maybe the propositions, maybe it seems like, I got a letter recently from somebody who said, Jason, this is a really interesting book. This is an anonymous person who found my book in a library in St. Louis. No, I don't know the person at all. And she wrote me a letter and she said, I really am interested in this book, but it's really frustrating to me because it seems like it's a code. Like I have to decode something. And that's something, she didn't say what that something was, but the implication was that what it was she had to decode was my intention. And in a way, it's completely backwards. It's her intention that she has to decode. And because at best, my reasons for putting these things together are only the first set of reasons why they should be together, and that itself is a sort of a relational task. Anyway, so the pictures move here. They move radically through places in Jewish geography, starting in Ukraine, at the edge of an overgrown Jewish cemetery, which, as you can see in the photograph, has been, the overgrowth has been interrupted in some way. You're standing at the edge of the interruption of the overgrowth. To a picture that's also dominated by flora, but in this case, it's a picture made from above, and we see houses and a single Jewish figure. That is, I think it's legible to many people that this is a Jewish figure, maybe some people not. To a picture in which flora, again, signifies strongly, but in this case it's a dried, eviscerated flora in some relationship with cracking cement walls. And then we move to a completely different kind of place, which is an interior. There's a gathering. The caption information will tell you that if you wanted to know that it's a bris-bat, or a welcoming ceremony for a young girl. And then from here, the human face is located in a very ambiguous way in the form of chipped and weathered porcelain photographs that have been adhered to tombstones, and there's a kind of hooded or lidded quality to the mossy growth that is on these tombstones. Okay, so in one photograph, in one sequence of photographs, or maybe we could call it one unit of meaning in the form of 5 photographs put together, there's a kind of, there's a very wide movement through space and through events, and there's a set of questions that I think, as I see it, a set of questions that are being asked. The book tells you, actually, in case you were wondering where the pictures come from, so that's Ukraine, this is New Jersey, this is San Francisco, this is Philadelphia, suburbs, and again in Ukraine, a different place in Ukraine. Is there something that pulls all of these things together as a Jewish site? The sequence of pictures is a Jewish site. Well, I think there is, but that's for you a question. The presence of the human figure is something that comes and goes throughout these pictures, as you'll see. I was quite careful not to emblematize the Jew in any way. I wanted to resist emblematizing the Jew while representing the Jew. And so the human face, or the portrait of the human being, is such a powerful signifier, and especially the Jewish body, which has been coded and recoded over centuries in terms of its essential social or its essential Jewish characteristics. I wanted to resist all of that coding, but at the same time to be able to draw on the natural power or seductiveness of the human figure, the human face. So the human face sometimes comes in the form of photographs of photographs. Occasionally it comes in the form of portraits, but in any case it's a recurring issue rather than a pivotal issue. So the first sequence of pictures here, I think, introduces the broad range of themes that I'm interested in, which has to do with disjunctures between sites, just disjunctures between time, as the quotation here says. It's not clear when the past began and ended. That's a question worth asking. When does this now moment begin? How long does it last? Do we consider ourselves a part of places that in some sense we locate as part of the Jewish past? And if so, how does that happen? The quality of ephemerality or transience or movement in and out of these locations is something that I wanted to signal in the first sequence. And then the first sequence ends here with maybe the most overt Jewish signifier, which is a sukkah, which is the hut that is used at the holiday of Sukkot, that is, Larry, is it fair to say that this is this a uniquely Jewish object, or is... I don't know of any...
I believe the sukkah.
The sukkah, yeah.
Well,
Is this anything like the sukkah up here?
well, I mean, you could say that it has its origins in huts that people used to build out in the fields where they would harvest.
Right.
But I don't know of other people who make them for similar purposes anyway.
Yeah, right.
As the ones now.
Yeah. Well, the sukkah, as I've always understood it, the sukkah is a remarkable symbol of vulnerability and transience, and to give the rabbis credit for a certain insight through liturgy, the sukkah represents. The sukkah is I guess, a statement or a symbol of a kind of harmony or peace that precisely depends on the stability of what's outside of it. This is my daughter in the sukkah, but I always, like Al Hirschfeld, I always have to work my daughter in some way to be... This is my daughter Miriam. I didn't pose her either. She just... I should say that none of these photographs are posed or scripted in any way. That's not the way I work. Anyway, so we move here from a resting place in the cemetery to a living sukkah. That's the end of the first sequence. The second sequence.
Was it even an issue to do black and white rather than color?
Was it an issue?
Yeah, did you have to make a decision? It's obviously black and white.
It's my language.
So your own language.
I would say almost entirely black and white. That's the language I speak, as it were, as a photographer. I do photograph in color casually, but not for the sake of serious work.
Is that generally true of photographers? It's mainly black and white?
I don't think there's any way of generalizing. I don't think there's any generalization. Some people look like this, and some people look like this. There was a review of this book in there's a journal of contemporary photography. It's really the most important journal I ever read this book. And there were other books. There are a handful of other books on similar subjects. This is the only one in black and white. Well, I mean, there's a connection. There's a historical connection. There's a direct connection to black and white is inherently abstract.
What is it said?
Well, this is an interesting question. I was just asking about the use of black and white, and it's kind of funny. This is a question that comes up from time to time, and his way of asking was a good way. Your question was, did it have to be this way? Or
was it a big decision?
Right, was it a big decision? And in a way, it was no decision, because I work in black and white almost entirely. It's sort of like, it's sort of like asking, do you walk, why walk on two legs or something? Because that's just the way we walk, right? For me, I'm a black and white photographer. It's a long practice. But I was saying that there was a review of this book and a few other books in the current issue of After Image. Some of you may know it as the sort of like the most important journal of contemporary photography, and this is the only project of the projects reviewed that is in black and white, and the recurring interpretation that the reviewer imposed, I could say, on my work, and it wasn't a bad interpretation, but I would done it quite this way, was to say that this is a work of mourning. He said, this is truly a work of mourning and melancholy. And he said it's mourning and melancholy for a lost identity. And I thought, okay, that's maybe a fair interpretation, but in a way, I would never have framed it that way myself, because I think that it actually, to speak of a lost identity is just not. I mean, I would say that it's certainly a work about loss within identity, which is different than to say it's a work about lost identity. The presence of loss or the presence of absence is something that Jews, especially in the last 100 years, which is, as I said, has been a very concentrated period of the historical forces that have been at play within Jewishness: migration, assimilation, persecution, resilience, self-preservation. All of these things have been concentrated in very strong ways in the last 100 years. And in that sense, absence and loss has also been strongly concentrated. And I think that any reasonable reckoning with Jewishness now has to somehow deal with brokenness or loss on its own terms, and has to integrate that on its own terms into some account of what it means to be Jewish or to see the Jewish. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is a work of mourning, however.
But do you think there's a time dimension to it? When you see it in black and white, it's gone. When you see it in color, it could be now.
There is a new 21st century photography critics thought that black and white is an analogy to poetry.
Yeah.
It's a more poetical way of saying things. That is a new recurring theme in photography criticism in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years.
Maybe. I mean, one of the sort of things that a viewer of photographs is always required to deal with is this distinction between prose and poetry. I mean, if the distinction between prose and poetry is that prose is a way of putting it, is a way of putting something that doesn't demand itself as the only or exact way of putting something. In other words, there might be some alternative way of creating meaning that would be adequate or just as adequate, and poetry is a way of creating meaning that depends on the exact relations of things in the words as they appear, and any change represents a change in meaning. Is that a fair distinction to make between prose and poetry?
That is your distinction.
That's one
distinction, because the
okay.
visual effects of a work, a photograph can be words, a word can be photographed. They are telling a story. Therefore, I respect what you're saying, and I can agree, but the poetry element is in order to justify why not to work in color.
What I mean is that if that distinction is right, then the poetry element can be there in black and white or in color.
True.
And the prose, so the prose element can also be there in black and white or in color. I think that black and white is an abstract way of working. There's an inherent abstractness that's there in making a black and white image, and I think that there's an alienating gesture that it's like a slap to a viewer. It's sort of a wake-up sense to a viewer. It alienates the image from some sense of mere reproduction. And so in that sense, there's a slap is not the right word, maybe just shape. Anyway, the second sequence here moves, as you can see, away from flora as a sort of dominant motif in the pictures, and it moves into urban spaces. And again, these urban spaces range from Philadelphia to Newark, New Jersey, to Los Angeles, to Brooklyn, to Kiev, to Paris, to a photo album in a small town in in the Ukraine to Krakow to Philadelphia and so forth. They range, they move back and forth across the geography. But in this case, the site of the photographs is the built environment or the unbuilt environment. The built and unbuilt environment. And the ruin or the issue of the remnant or the ruin within the built environment that's explicitly Jewish is something that sort of comes and goes through the sequence. Moving to this wall, how are we doing with time, by the way, Ricardo? I don't want to go over. Ricardo?
20 after 5, I mean, you can keep going with it.
Okay, just let me know that we have another 15 minutes.
Yeah, I would say.
By the time you come over here, this sequence of pictures on the back wall is a...
I'm saying you about the faces. I don't want to stop you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I guess I should say more.
Dwellings.
Yeah, that's right. The series mutates into a consideration of the face, and there's pretty much an alternation between the photograph of the photograph of the face and the photograph of the photograph. I really wanted to draw on this, what I thought of as sort of a family album of the Jewish peoples that I found in the cemetery of various sites in Eastern Europe. It's not exclusively a Jewish practice. You see it in other non-Jewish cemeteries also. To some extent, the immigrant generation at the beginning of the 20th century carried this over, so there are some cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries mostly, where you'll see this. But now these portraits have become, these portraits are a kind of dispersed family album that is subjected to every kind of exposure, from weather to vandals or appreciations, whatever. In most cases in Eastern Europe, these places that now have large Jewish cemeteries have very few Jews left, especially in Ukraine and Russia. And the dead represent the Jewish population in these places, and that's the reason why many of the cemeteries are untended, overgrown, forsaken. So I guess I asked a question about the nature of the status of the dead within Jewish memory by using these portraits, these floating ovals within the squares, these dislocated floating ovals. And I quite consciously wanted to use the portrait, which is a direct encounter with another person. I wanted to use it in some dialogue with the displaced encounter with the dead that these porcelain, weathered porcelain portraits represented.
I might be confused.
Yeah.
There's a Jewish cemetery on the way to Strathmore. I might be transferring it probably, but I think they have those pictures.
I've never been to it.
It's not a very big one. It flies right by.
Right.
Could be that the people are from the community where it's
Yeah. There are a few of them I've seen in this country that have them. Not that many, but a few.
That's a European.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right. Although interestingly, it's continued in a different form. There's the new practice in Europe is to do portraits in sand-blasted low relief.
So artistic.
Right. Well, it doesn't create the sense of weatheredness and deterioration. The pictures are a part of the stone used, usually granite. But
these are so realistic. I mean, the photographs are scary. At least the first time I saw them, because they're so real.
Yeah.
You're not mistaken what's inside.
Right.
You can have all sorts of views for
Right.
regular tombstones.
Yeah, that's right. The pictures on the back wall here are an effort to present this pivot point in the last century, which is the Shoah. And they are nothing like a history of the Shoah or a movement through there are a couple of iconic moments in the sequence of pictures, but for the most part, I would call them aniconic or not iconic moments of engagement with the landscape of the Shoah. They include, if those of you who know the history of the Shoah know that the Shoah was not one event, there were many events that occurred simultaneously, and the history of the knowledge of those events is piecemeal in some cases, very piecemeal. And so there's the Shoah, besides the scale and size and the sheer scope of the calamity, the Shoah in many ways is really beyond our education. It's at the very edge of our communication. And so it asks to photograph the Shoah, I think asks a photographer to deal with that edge in some meaningful way. On the other hand, there is a long tradition of people who go to the landscape of the Shoah and they present these sort of sentimentalized or romanticized pictures. And I'm very aware of that, and in some sense, I'm loath to make any pictures of the Shoah for want of, not wanting to reproduce that. But the brokenness of meaning, is the quotation here from Avant-Garde indicates, the brokenness of meaning is the sort of leading issue for me in moving through this place. This is also a place, and several times this has come up for me, where people will say to me, beauty, really, where meaning is broken, beauty seems to assert itself in their pictures. And they might point to a picture like this one with the birch trees, or others of them. And that is an interesting discussion about the place of beauty and how it's possible that what you call beauty or what seems to be beauty is a mask for a placeholder for something else once you begin to deal with the photographs in the context of other photographs. Okay. There are books here. It's nice to see people with books. And the last sequence of pictures here that I think tends to raise the question of how is it that if diaspora here is a tool for thinking about the Jewish in visual form, it's a tool for thinking about how to put together, as I wrote in the beginning, dispersedness and scatteredness and loss and lack. How are those things, as I wrote somewhere else, how are those things going to be a motivation for Jewish culture, a motivation for Jewish culture? How to retain those things in some way? And that's an issue which I wanted to begin to deal with in the last sequence of pictures, the question of diasporas, the retention of diaspora in some way that's not elegiac, that's not nostalgic, and that's not strictly an issue of mourning, but the retention of this movement between absence and presence that might be a resource for Jewishness now. That's my problem in the last sequence, or more overtly my problem in the last sequence of pictures. I started, as you can see, the sequence with two photographs, one of which has certain formal relationships between each other. The presence of a a strong anchoring vertical line. In this case, it's a piece of rebar. In this case, it's a pitchfork, an unusual pitchfork. It's a pitchfork made out of a branch which is hardly straightened out. But in this case, we see what seems like a dilapidated home environment that happens to have this ripe fruit on its steps. And then in this case, we see the clearing of the Jewish cemetery. It returns. Now we can actually see the clearing happening. There's a burning of these leaves. I guess you could call that there's a certain reference to an offering going on in that photograph. These two pictures, I wanted to put them together as an initiation into that set of problems. And then the formal element is retained in the movement to the next picture, which shows a really, again, a sort of radical displacement in terms of landscape and place. This is a photograph of what you might call a typical suburban synagogue. The kind of, when I was growing up, the kind of place I thought of as a very soulless Jewish American place. And I grew up in Southern California, but the synagogue that my family belonged to had this feeling about it. It didn't look like this, but it had this feeling about it, kind of bunkered and without character and without something that seemed a little soulless to me. This, as you can see, is the most sustained sequence. It's the longest sequence in the room. And the pictures modulate in and out of a sense of a sort of a hunger for the Jewish past within American and European life, and an effort to push that past forward into youth or at least a youthful thinking. Hence, by the time we get to the end, there's a communal celebration, a synagogue, celebration of another sort, a very old woman. This is, in fact, my cousin. But so that's one tour. Is there any comments or questions to ask? There's all this conversation going on. I wish I could hear it.
It's hard not to think of it as mournful. There's cemeteries, there's smoke,
Yeah.
peculiar pitchforks, there's synagogues that are upsetting it.
Yeah.
And it's, so I don't know how you get there's the other side of the diaspora, the huge success and prosperity and future and great things that have happened.
Right. Yeah, that's all of that is true. I guess maybe the failure of this book is that
The book is not a failure.
No, it is a failure. I could tell, this is my wife before I left today. She says to me, Jason, do not take a critical tour of those pictures with whoever shows up in that gallery, because she knows that my inclination is to criticize every picture and show why it's a failure. No, the book, when you're the creator of something, you know it's failures. You know why it failed. So I guess that's maybe a special knowledge. But what I was going to say is that the dichotomy between success and brokenness is very strong. And I think that, when I mentioned in the beginning here, without communal formations that would authorize them, I think I was responding to this sense that organized Jewishness presents at most half of the picture, most of the time. And that is the upward and onward dimension of diaspora. That seems to me to be, it's not a false view, but it's a partial view, and I guess I wanted as a contribution to, and maybe I went too far, I don't know. I can't judge that yet. In a few years, maybe I'll pick up this book and I'll really know the answer to this question. But what I wanted to do was to try to indicate the other side of that dichotomy, which is, to me, very much at play within contemporary Jewishness. To try to indicate that the flattened version of the story is simply, it's neither an accurate version of the story or a desirable version of the story.
So in a sense, you're suggesting that this is a counter-narrative?
Is a what?
A counter-narrative?
I think of it as a counter-narrative, yeah. In a sense. In a sense, if it's a narrative, if it's simply, well, put it this way, I mean, there is, of course, this narrative of victimization that, and if this series of pictures is read as confirmation of that narrative, then no, it's not a counter-narrative. But, I didn't expect many Jews to like this work, let's put it that way. I expected this to be the sort of work that would irritate a lot of Jewish viewers because they would see it as a dredging of, why do we have to look at what here's a little story that indicates this. There was a synagogue in Philadelphia where I lived that I used to be a member of. It considers itself a progressive synagogue. And I have a friend who grew up in South Philadelphia. He's not Jewish, but he grew up as what's known as a Shabbos boy. He's a little kid who would turn lights on and off for Jews on Saturdays, and he would do stuff for the community. He was a very mixed neighborhood. He was very much, in a way, a part of the Jewish community. Well, most of the Jews have left South Philadelphia. They moved up. They moved on. They moved up. They left. They went to this neighborhood. They went to another neighborhood. They went to the suburbs. Joe Van Blunk still lives in Jewish South Philadelphia, what was Jewish South Philadelphia. The Jews who left South Philadelphia more or less left as a group at a certain moment in the late 50s, and they basically left their communal architecture and buildings. They just left it. Some of it they sold, some of it they abandoned. Well, there's a synagogue that's down the street from where Joe Van Blunk lives, this friend of mine, and the place was, actually it's that synagogue right there. What's it called? It used to be called, no. It was a little...
father-in-law was the rabbi.
Oh, really? No. It was, the name is not in my head right now, but it'll come to me in a second. Anyway, the place was, really, as you can see in that photograph, the place was just completely beaten. So he went in there, and he, and it was a condemned building. He went in there and he told me about this. There were prayer books on the floors, and it was just like the Jews just left the place. Right. And there was a yahrzeit plaque that was in the synagogue, and it was, those who aren't Jewish, yahrzeit plaque is this plaque that commemorates the death anniversary of members of the synagogue. So Joe rescued this thing, and a few months later the synagogue was condemned, and it was actually demolished by the city. So Joe Van Blunk has this yahrzeit plaque in his house. And he goes to the Museum of American Jewish History downtown in Philadelphia, and he says, listen, we rescued this thing out of this old synagogue. Do you want it? And the museum says, no, we don't want it. They looked at it, they said, we might want it if we could refurbish it, but we don't really want to refurbish it. And Joe says, you want to refurbish it? He says, its condition is part of its Jewishness, isn't it? Or maybe words to that effect. And they said, that's not the Jewishness we want to show. And so they said no. So I approached this congregation, Mishkan Shalom in Philadelphia, and I said, do you want it? I have this friend who has it. The museums are about ready to throw it out or give it back to Joe. You guys want it. And they're in the middle of debating whether they want it or not, because there are many reasons why they might or might not want it as a religious community. But I think the museum's disinclination to accept this broken piece of Jewish history as something that's worth showing is sort of symptomatic of the narrative that I myself am trying to work against. In some sense, work against. Does anybody have anybody else have any questions?
I sort of saw in the photographs like a disappearance, like things constantly disappearing.
Yeah.
Is that sort of like your vision of the future of Judaism? Like, is there any kind of like, because you'll see like a rabbi, or what seems he was a rabbi that's now blurred.
Right.
You'll see, photographs that are now crumpled or, finishing. So is that, any? That's
a very good question. I don't, there is definitely an entropy in this body of work. There's an entropic quality, like things moving towards a chaotic or unformed state. Yes. But the answer, I'm not a prognosticator. That's not my role. I don't see Jewish life as disappearing in some calamitous sense. No, I see Jewish life as a dialogue between presence and absence. And that predicament is what I am offering as Jewish life. Not as a disappearance or vanishing.
So let me just say that when you comment on the fact that the Jewish community probably won't like this, it really made me think of the fact that when Philip Roth wrote his first short stories and books about the Jewish community hated it. And so if that's any indication of your profession, then thank you very much.
You're welcome.